everybody. My name is Ken Masson, and welcome to you all. I am the president of the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy. We are a club that focuses on the world, like our name says, and we also focus on advocacy, and we work on advocating for the human rights for people with disabilities around the world. And I have the pleasure of having with me today Jeremy. Jeremy is not president, but maybe someday. I'm working on it, Jeremy. Jeremy is a member of the club, actually what we call a charter member of the club, which means he's been with us from day one and even before day one. So welcome, Jeremy. Nice to have you here.
It is a pleasure as always.
Why don't you introduce yourself, because I didn't do a proper introduction, so why don't you go ahead and do that?
No, you were doing fine. So I am a consultant, public speaker, and CEO of my own organization, Walking Spirit, which provides accessible diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultation and support services, inspirational speaking services, and also quality of life, adaptability, and advocacy coaching for any individual with a disability or families affected by a disability. So I am in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States. I am also a certified member of the Americans with Disabilities Act Trainer Leadership Network, which is a group of individual trainers who have been certified to provide the curriculum approved by the national network of the 10 regional ADA centers. So that's a lot, but I spend a lot of my time talking about accessibility, both in terms of the law, but also more to the point in terms of as an aspect of diversity, DEIB, and how really it has to come first, or else you're not able to achieve those DEI goals that get you that ultimate sense of belonging for your associates, your consumers, your peers, and really promotes an overall improvement in public health. So that's what I do, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be part of the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocates.
Thank you. And that's why we're here today. We wanted to talk about Americans Disabilities Act, the American with Disabilities Act, and it's a fascinating subject, even if you're not in America, because yeah, we'll get into that. We'll get into that. So, why don't you tell us about what is the ADA?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act, in a nutshell, is a piece of legislation that provides civil rights to any person with a disability from discrimination based upon that disability.
Ah, very good. And and again, so you're connected with it because now you're an advisor in that capacity.
I'm a trainer, I think is a better way to put it. And yes, I do absolutely incorporate looking at aspects of the ADA in the consulting that I do with organizations throughout the community.
And the ADA has Americans with Disabilities Act has been around for since the 1990s. Is that true?
It might surprise many to learn that that law was not signed until 1990. Um, and it's interesting because the United States went through or began its civil rights movement really much further back. And, we had a Civil Rights Act that was signed into law in the 60s, but people with disabilities were not included in that Civil Rights Act. And so it took until 1990 for us to get the same protections that the Civil Rights Act afforded to people based upon race, religion, age, gender, and national origin.
Okay, that's amazing. It's amazing it took so long. And the ADA, let's talk a little bit about it. How is it funded? Who's funding it? And I'm not sure what funding means. I mean, what would be the money spent on it?
That's an interesting question. So, I think the way to answer that is, so, for instance, actually the very first piece of real civil rights legislation that began to protect people with disabilities in the United States, with any substance, was Section 504, which is actually the last line of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that stated that any organization that was receiving federal funding had to be accessible. And so that began to open up schools, airports, um, travel to that degree. And really just any organization that was receiving federal funding at that time. That did not apply to the public sector. It didn't apply to any of our regular businesses. Um, in terms of funding for the ADA, I would say the answer to that is when it comes to making modifications to make a facility acceptable, that funding comes from the business owner. If we're talking about making a government building or a government program accessible, that funding comes from the government program or the government department that is doing that programming. Does that make
Okay, so I
sense?
think it does make sense. I think I need to back up a little bit for here first.
Sure.
Um, the question, I guess, is then who is monitoring? Who's the one overseeing it? Who's the one?
Ah, okay. So, in regards to who enforces the ADA,
Right.
that falls on the Department of Justice. And then, depending on what title of the ADA we're talking about, there may be additional government departments. For instance, Title II of the ADA covers all public entities. So that's your state and local governments, your public transportation, anything that falls under that kind of category. And there are 8 different federal departments that are charged with enforcing the ADA within that category of the law. Because you could be dealing with a public entity in regards to farming, and so the Department of Agriculture needs to be involved. If it's something that impacts public schools, then it's going to be the Department of Education that needs to be involved. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And before I get to saying something else here, I want to just say hello to Sonini, who's with us. She's a club member
Oh, wonderful.
from Zimbabwe. From Zimbabwe. From Zimbabwe. So, does it? I mean, it sounds complicated, Jeremy. Does it work? Does it work?
Does it work? Yes, but only to the point that the spirit of the ADA is embraced by the people that it protects, as well as the people that are meant to provide those accommodations to ensure that people with disabilities are included in all aspects of our community. Um, and so you may, like, for instance, we might want to back up a little bit and just simply talk about how the ADA defines who a person with a disability is.
Yeah, that's a good question. That was actually one of my questions here. So let
So,
me ask you that question. How does the ADA define who a person with disability is?
sure. So, yeah, let's jump to that. There are actually 3 different definitions, and it can kind of get confusing. The one that is the most straightforward is any person who has a mental or a physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so that would apply to people with physical disabilities, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people who were naturally born with their disabilities, and others who acquired their disabilities. It also applies to people who have permanent disabilities and those who have temporary ones, because sometimes a disability is only in effect for a period of time, and if you're lucky, you never have to deal with it again. Other disabilities are more intermittent. Other disabilities come up later in life. So to account for some of the different aspects of that, the second definition is a person who has a history or record of a diagnose or of such a disability. So again, it's something that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that might be something that is noted in a medical diagnosis. Again, maybe it's a disability that is not visible or always active in regards to the way that it's affecting the individual who bears that disability. But um, but if there is a medical diagnosis, that person is covered from discrimination based upon disability. If there's a notation in school records or family history or human resources files or even just government documentation, that person is protected from discrimination against disabilities. The third definition, which gets even more confusing, is a person who is perceived by others as having a disability.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if we were on a panel discussion and you and I were both sitting there on that panel discussion, and which I left out of my introduction, I believe, am wearing my prosthetic legs because I'm a bilateral above knee amputee and a burn survivor. Um, and somebody in that audience sees you and I on that panel, and they think that because you're sitting next to me on that panel, even though you don't have a visible disability, you must have some kind of disability to be included on that panel with me, even if that's not the case. But if they make that assumption, they perceive you as having a disability. That is not in and of itself illegal, but if they then were to discriminate against you for, say, um, an opportunity for employment or inclusion at a public event, if they were to discriminate against you based upon the fact that they perceived that you had a disability, you would also be protected by the civil rights protections provided by the ADA.
How interesting. That's very interesting. So, let me throw with a couple of disabilities at you. Epilepsy, would that be covered?
Epilepsy absolutely is. And an interesting note, that is a disability that could have be very episodic in nature. And while the ADA was signed into law in 2000 or in 1990, over the course of the next 20 years, the protections of the ADA were actually whittled down by case law to a point where the people that fell under these definitions, it had changed to where very few people were actually provided with these protections. And
Hmm.
so it required an amendments act that was signed into law in 2009, much of which was to be implemented in 2010,
Hmm.
that restored those original definitions and specified that episodic disabilities like epilepsy were always covered regardless of whether or not the episodic nature of the disability was in effect. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
Yeah.
It makes sense. I thought I was going to throw you off, but you did a good job.
Thanks.
Um, how about depression?
Depression absolutely falls into that category.
Would something like a chronic disease like cancer fall in there?
Yes. Yeah.
It would.
And, that is
Okay.
one that might perhaps be a temporary disability, hopefully, in that the cancer in and of itself is eradicated and the disability doesn't ever return. But if somebody were, again, even later down the road, if they knew that they had cancer and they were discriminating against them based upon that, the ADA would still protect them.
Huh. Very interesting. Um, so is the ADA, and this is, is a act like the ADA only in the United States, or do other countries have them too?
Other countries, not all countries, but other countries do have civil rights protections for people with disabilities. My understanding is that some of those pieces of legislation were inspired by the ADA, and they are similar in nature. Others are not, and then again, still others, and too many don't have any kind of civil rights protections in place.
Right. And I know even in the case of the ADA, and where other countries do have similar acts, part of the problem is that it's a law, but it's not being acted on.
Yeah, and you would ask the question, does it work? And this is where it falls to, in the United States at least, it falls to people with disabilities to be the ones who are the ADA police. While there are different federal departments that are charged with enforcing the law, they are not out there looking for violations. They are not
Mm-hmm.
out there other than through the building inspector checking everything out before they approve a building to be opened up for business.
Mm-hmm.
They're not out there looking for these things. And even then, even though a building inspector may have all the training that they need to have regarding the accessible design standards that are laid out in that 2009 ADA Amendments Act, um, that even with that information, without having a person with a disability to actually look at the way those codes are applied, it
Mm-hmm.
is highly possible to misapply the ADA, think that you're completely accessible, and still have approached it in a way that could cause a life safety risk and potential financial damages to the owner and also the tenant. If there is, say, a business that is leasing space and there's an issue with a parking lot, if that parking lot serves that business that is leasing that space, it's on both the business owner and the owner of the parking lot to address it.
Okay. And am I correct that it doesn't just cover physical accessibility, it also covers digital
Yeah.
accessibility?
Program accessibility. And so, for instance, let's talk about the way that the ADA is sort of laid out. There are 5 different titles. This will give you a good sense of how or where it applies. How it applies is different based upon which title of the law we're talking about. Title One applies to employment, so it is all about prohibiting disability based discrimination in all aspects of the employment process, from the application to the hiring to the work reviews and disciplinary action and even termination, however that may occur. Title Two applies to public entities, so again, that's your local and state governments. It's also your public transportation, and then
Okay.
Title Three, and that, so when we talk about public transportation, there I'm talking about public transportation like the city bus line, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a private yellow cab company. The private
Mm-hmm.
yellow cab company is going to fall under Title III, which is public
Mm-hmm.
accommodations. And this is
Okay.
the aspect of the ADA that has had the biggest impact on the lives of people with disabilities in this country, whether they are residents of this country or people visiting the country. This is the aspect that opened up the restaurants, the hotels, the stores, and other places of business. Um,
Mm-hmm.
to your question about digital, that would fall under Title IV, which is telecommunications,
Mm-hmm.
and then as you had asked about physical, there's also the programmatic aspect piece of this, and that applies to all aspects of the ADA as well. And then the fifth title that we haven't talked about is really just miscellaneous provisions. And what's really important about that is that if you were to stand up and advocate on my behalf because you felt I was being discriminated against based upon my disability,
Hmm.
and your employer or somebody in a position of power were to discriminate against you based upon
Hmm.
that action, you're now protected by the ADA as well.
Ah, interesting. So it's interesting that from that standpoint that it was created in 1990, and certainly at that point, anything digital was in its infancy at that point, kind of. So has it ever been amended, the ADA,
Wait,
since then, or is it?
yes. So that would be that ADA Amendments Act that was signed into law in 2009, and that brought up to date to that point in time those things related to digital access because yeah, things like that were relatively in their infancy. We were not at a point yet where we had a way to communicate like this. And it's interesting how COVID impacted the world by pushing that technology forward. Um,
Hmm.
it, whether we're talking about technological advancement or just communal usage of this technology, changing the way we communicate. So now, all of us are more aware, I think, of needing to ask questions like, do we need to turn on the closed captioning? Um, but we
Hmm.
don't necessarily look at things like, as I know you're well aware, alt text and
Hmm.
audio descriptions and that
Hmm.
kind of stuff. It would
Hmm.
all fall under that aspect.
Okay. So, in a broad question, what does the ADA mean to somebody with a disability?
To me, it means I have a right to participate in all aspects of my community.
Okay.
And there are, as I know there are areas where that's not necessarily as clear, but it gives me at least the strength to see if I see a violation, to go to whoever is responsible for that or for correcting that, and to be able to have a conversation that is not just a me saying, hey, I need you to fix this because I have this problem. It gives me the ability to say, you need to address this because there is a law in place that protects my civil rights and the civil rights of
Hmm.
others like me.
Hmm.
And there are penalties that could result in you paying severe damages if you don't
Hmm.
address this, not to
Okay.
mention the life safety risk possibilities.
Okay. So, what type of organizations are we talking about? What kind of organizations are affected by the ADA?
So a covered entity, and that is the language in the ADA, is going to apply to anybody or any organization, business, any entity with 15 or more employees. It's going to apply to any public government agencies, regardless of whether or not they receive any federal assistance. It's going to apply to or apply to privately operated commercial entities, and so that's going to be private schools, colleges, banks, restaurants, theaters, hotels, private transportation, supermarkets, shopping malls, museums, recreational facilities, sports arenas, medical, legal, and insurance offices, and so much more. Where it doesn't apply is private clubs, religious organizations, and while I did mention private schools, if it is a religious private school that's not receiving any kind of funding, and there may
Hmm.
be states where they do receive state funding, but they're not required to comply with the ADA under that state's regulations, where religious schools do not necessarily have to comply with the ADA.
Interesting. And why is that?
So I believe that, and I think rightfully so, there has to be a line where the federal government does not have the ability to say to you, you have to go spend money on this.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think where they chose to draw that line here was at those private clubs, those, and then where the religious organizations and the religious private schools fall under that is that within the United States, we have a separation of church and state as one of
Hmm.
our major fundamental values.
Hmm. And I know you and I are in Rotary, but you told me Rotary's included in it doesn't cover Rotary clubs, service organizations such as Rotary.
So if it is classified as a private club, then yeah, it would fall into that exempt loophole, which then brings us back to that question of what is the right thing to do to ensure that we incorporate as much of our population as possible. And we have a tendency to look at people with disabilities and not necessarily acknowledge the disability and see them as falling under some other category that's visually obvious. I'm a white guy, I'm a male. Those are the things that people would automatically assume. And so I think as a result, they think, oh, well, if you have a disability, it's you're protected because you have these other protections, but they tend to fail to recognize the accessibility piece of that. That having a
Okay.
disability means the way that we access our community is different and needs support.
Okay. In the defense of churches, though, I've been to a lot of churches that have ramps there. So I mean,
Yes. And that,
they're
so that absolutely is, and that's where we're talking about that accessible DEI piece is recognizing that regardless of whether or not there's a law that says that you need to do this, or whether or not you apply to that law, doing it is the right thing to do. And so congregations that have recognized that people with disabilities represent up to a quarter of the population, if not more, um, they want those people to be able to get into their church, to be able to experience the spiritual aspects of their life.
hmm. So I mean, for corporations, for example, there is an expense they're going to have to incur in order to be accessible.
So there, as we get into the ADA and the different definitions, there's something called reasonable accommodations, um,
Hmm.
that typically is something that applies to, yes, corporations. If you have an employee with a disability, they are able to achieve the essential functions of the job with reasonable accommodation. Then you have to have a conversation about what those reasonable accommodations are. Sometimes those reasonable accommodations are simply a matter of strategy and cost nothing at all. Other times, those reasonable accommodations may require physical adjustments, modifications to the environment. And so there's a balance test to determine whether or not it's actually reasonable. And what you're looking at there is there a substantial expense to put the accommodation that's being requested in place? Or does it create a substantial difficulty to the operation, like changing the nature of the business itself, to be able to employ that associate? And if that's the case, then those are not reasonable accommodations, and the employer is not required to make them. But,
So go ahead. Go ahead.
well, the but is that when you sit down to talk about those reasonable accommodations, the reasonable accommodation has to be requested by the employee, not dictated by the employer. And it
Oh,
has to
interesting.
be agreed to by the employee, not
Hmm.
dictated by the employer.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. So, and who is the one who makes the decision? Is this a reasonable accommodation or not?
Again, it's really broken down into a balance test. And so if you can't show that the accommodation that's being requested is going to put you into a situation where it's going to cause a financial damage, then it's a reasonable accommodation. So who
Well, let
determines
me give you
that,
an.
is really that balance test.
It might
And
have to
then
come
I
down
guess
to
ultimately,
the
yeah,
courts too, right?
ultimately, if the employer is unwilling to make those accommodations, then the individual needs to file a complaint with the ADA, and it falls to the Department of Justice,
Okay.
and it might involve the Department of Labor.
Okay. And we'll get to that, but let me give you an example. I mean, we'll get to how you're going to do that, but let me give you an
Yeah.
example. I think the ADA covers a deaf person in a job interview that the employer is supposed to provide an interpreter,
Yes.
correct? And that
Yes,
that
that would be
interpreter
correct.
then, yeah, that interpreter, if that employer then says, no, I'm not going to do it, because I don't think many do. I may be wrong. I'm not sure about that. But if the employer says no, what happens then? Then you got to file a complaint.
Well, that is what I would recommend. So, yes, if the employer were to say no, first question is going to be, okay, well, why are you saying no? And if they are saying no because they don't have the time to book a interpreter to be there for the interview, then it's a matter of rescheduling the interview for when the interpreter can be there. If they're saying that they can't do it because they can't pay for the interpreter, then we have to look at how much is the interpreter charging. And typically, an interpreter is charging a fee by the hour plus transportation time as well to get
Mm-hmm.
to wherever
Mm-hmm.
it's taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to look at that. And so if it is an operation that doesn't make a profit, and or rather doesn't have any financial stuff going on, maybe it's a volunteer operation and they don't have any funding and they can't afford to pay for that interpreter, then that would be an undue hardship on them, and so
Right.
they wouldn't need to do that. But if it
Right.
is a an organization that has revenue coming in, they're going to need to show that paying for that 1 hour plus transportation for the interpreter for the interview is going to break the bank for them. They're going to have to show that to be able to say that's why they're saying no. If if they're still saying no, then yeah, I would advise the individual to notify the Department of Justice.
Okay. So, and it's not like the employer can think, oh, my brother-in-law knows sign language, so I'll bring him in and interpret for you. It has to be a certified,
Yeah, it needs to be
registered, whatever.
somebody who is an interpreter, who I mean, who is certified to be an interpreter, not someone who just happens to know ASL. Now they could ask the individual, would you be okay if I had my brother-in-law who knows ASL because his son is deaf or his son-in-law is deaf or whatever, and he learned it? Would you be okay with him coming in and doing the interpretation? And if the individual says, "Yeah, sure, that's fine," then it's fine. It's about talking about what the accommodation is and how it's going to be applied, and coming to a mutual agreement about how that works. But it's got to be based upon the needs of the individual with the disability. If their need is a
Hmm.
certified interpreter, then that is their need.
On the other end, though, the person applying for the job could say, okay, I'll bring my brother-in-law with me, and I'm okay with that. That's all right, right? That's fine.
That if that is the accommodation that they're requesting and it doesn't cost the employer anything, the answer should be yes.
Okay, so what you're saying then in that situation, just so people understand that it is on the shoulders of the business to provide the interpreter if there is no other option.
Yes, and for them to make certain that the interpreter that they're providing meets the qualifications agreed upon by the individual that they're going to be interviewing who's requesting that accommodation.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. Okay, so we just talked about this situation. Can you talk about some ideas of some other violations there might be?
So, for instance, going back to that perceived as definition, if you were interviewing somebody and you saw that they had a facial tic, and because you saw a TV show that talked about how somebody with Tourette's might have a facial tic, you assume that that individual might have Tourette's, and you don't want to hire them to work in your restaurant because you're afraid they might start cussing because, again, that was part of that TV show that you watched that talked about it and the way that Tourette's was portrayed in that. Um, if you don't hire that person because of that reason, you are discriminating against that person based upon a disability that they may or may not even have. Um, when it comes to sitting down in a job interview, the ADA is very clear that you are not allowed to ask about the nature of somebody's disability. All that you can ask about in regards to that at all is their ability to perform the essential functions of the job. And so, even there, when you're doing an interview, you need to be clear about what are the essential functions of the job, and don't try to make it about the secondary functions. So for instance, and with my background having been in hotels and restaurants, that's where my examples are going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
If say you were interviewing somebody for a job where the primary essential function of their job is going to be to answer the phones, to determine, to handle whatever it is that the guest is asking about, whether it's making reservations or getting something, talking to a different department, getting ordering room service, whatever the case may be. um,
Mm-hmm.
if as a secondary aspect of that job, you would be responsible for, say, delivering the guest's request for extra towels.
Right.
If that's a secondary aspect of the job, then that is an incidental duty. It's not something that this individual needs to be weighed upon in regards to their ability to do the job. We have to find a
Okay.
way to accommodate that.
Okay. So, um, going back to that job interview, where that person cannot ask about your disability. However, if the person being interviewed discloses that they have a disability, then that now allows the employer to ask questions.
Um, I would still be very, very careful. But yes, if somebody discloses that they have a disability, I would again keep my questions focused on how is that going to affect your ability to perform this function of the job. I would not get into asking questions about how did you acquire that disability? Do you have to take medications to manage that disability? I would stay away from anything related to the nature of it.
Okay. And I mean, obviously, some visible disability is a visible disability. Something like autism is invisible.
Right.
So, I mean, if I come in a wheelchair, it's obvious I have a disability, but still, that employer cannot ask questions about it.
Um, yeah, they can't ask questions about how did you wind up in that wheelchair. They can ask questions about to handle serving a table
Okay.
if you were to be a server in a restaurant. They could
Okay.
ask, are there any reasonable accommodations that you would need to be able to achieve these functions of the job at that point? But again, it is not, the individual with the disability is not required to disclose that they have a disability at any point. There are points where the employer, after they have offered a position, can ask if they want to disclose a disability. But
Okay.
that's, they're not required to do so.
Okay. It's a fascinating conversation, and it can go on for a long time here. But
Sure.
we got
And
I got a few more questions for you, but before we wrap it up. But I just
sure.
want to give a little add here that we again are from the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy, where we work on a global level, and our goal is to advocate for people, the human rights for people with disabilities, and we're doing a number of things around the world. And if anybody's interested in more information about the club, they can write to us at RotaryWDA@gmail.com. Okay, so now there are some organizations that are grandfathered into that they can go to pre-ADA, correct?
Well, so grandfathered is not a good word because really nobody is grandfathered whatsoever. There are safe harbors in regards to when you need to make accommodations, whether or not you need to make a modification. And this is really applying more to any organization or facility that was pre-existing the 1990 law. And so it wasn't like poof, we made this law, and so now everything needs to be accessible. We recognized that that's unrealistic, and so what was put in place was that if you were a pre-existing facility and you had not done any changes to your facility after 1990, then you don't need to comply. However, you do need to comply to the maximum extent feasible. So you need to remove any potential barriers that can be easily or readily removed. So, but when it comes to putting in a ramp um, to get into the building, if you made any major changes to the facility, you're not required to put that ramp in place. If you're a building, you are only required to comply with the ADA up to the point that that the modifications don't threaten or change the historic nature of the building. But once you put renovation money into updating a facility, you have to make that facility accessible. And if you're offering a program, say, for instance, you're offering a course on how to learn how to speak Spanish, and you're offering that in a building that it doesn't have an elevator, and you put that program on the second floor of the building, and somebody who uses a wheelchair wants to attend that class, you need to move that class to a accessible location for that individual. Does that make sense?
Okay, that makes sense. Does it also cover? Um, I'm not sure what I'm going to ask you. Um, does it also cover the ADA? Does it cover other employees in that organization if they should say something that's discriminatory towards somebody with a disability? Or is that covered under another
Uh,
law?
no, I believe that would absolutely fall under Title One, and so if because another employee is still an agent of the organization, so if another employee is saying something that is discriminatory, um, the first step right there is to go to first, if you feel safe, educate that individual about how they're being discriminatory, because more often than not it's just because somebody didn't know and they used some language that went out of style in the 60s, or said something that was inappropriate as a joke. They weren't intending to upset somebody, so it should be okay to educate someone. But if it creates then you go to your supervisor, you go to your, make them aware of the issue, and you let them handle it. If they don't address it, then again, we are back to it's time to file a complaint with the Department of Justice. And
Mm-hmm.
there is a way to do that, and the process is not fast. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that is something, again, kind of going back to what I'd said earlier. The ADA only works as much as people with disabilities utilize it and report issues that they encounter and continue to stick with it to make certain those issues are addressed. Um, it's a it's
Okay, so
it's a frustrating process. It
no,
can go
I
much
understand this.
easier if the person you're connecting with is simply saying, "Hey, this is a good idea."
Yeah, no, and of
I'm sorry.
course, many things are frustrating processes. But let's the final question I have for you is now. Okay, we talked about it. Now, if somebody feels they have a legitimate complaint, how do they approach it?
So, as always, like I said, my first recommendation is for anybody who feels like there's a violation, whether it's a physical or a programmatic violation, um, that they need to approach the business owner, the employer, the government department, and make them aware of the issue. And so I recommend trying to do that with a phone call or a face to face conversation and following that up with a letter. Always document the communication in writing, even if it was we met yesterday and I spoke with you while I was in your store. Follow it up with that letter and reference that conversation so that it's documented. Make certain that um, in addition to that, that you also documenting with pictures or a line if it's a repetitive issue. For instance, a coffee shop, the drive-through, and the drive-through line crosses over where the acceptable parking spaces are, so that somebody with a disability cannot park or leave if the drive-through line is at moderate to peak volume. That's completely out of their control when they're going to be able to go. So there's definitely a violation there, even though they have the parking spaces they need. So making somebody aware of that, taking pictures, documenting when the issue is a problem, if it's a repetitive issue, and then allowing a reasonable time frame for the issue to be resolved. And I would say no more than 30 days unless the person is saying, hey, we are addressing this. We're taking in bids for contractors. We're scheduling it to get it done. If you see motion, that's really as far as you got to go. Congratulations. That's a win. You got them to move forward on it. But if it's still not moving forward, I would send one last letter and then I would go online or submit via mail a complaint to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. And the website, you go to ada.gov /file a complaint, and that will take you to all of the information you need. And if you decide to print out the complaint form and for you to read it, and make certain that you've got that in your hands to go through everything, that's fine. You then mail that into the Department of Justice, and the address is right there on that webpage. Or you just simply click the link that says file a complaint by submitting a report to the Department of Justice Division. And when you click that, it takes you through all the same fields that are on that paper form. It gives you a chance to attach all of your documentation. And it could be months. It could be up to 6 months, maybe more, before you get a letter from the Department of Justice letting you know whether or not they feel that your complaint is worth mediation or investigation or further attention. And if they might refer you to mediation, which takes place before they ever investigate a complaint. They feel like a legitimate conversation with the offending party, but we want you to do that with a neutral mediator in place. And so
Okay,
when they do that, you have 30 days to say yes or no. And then you until the date is up. And I waited 2 years with a complaint before I found myself in mediation. And that mediation was successful. And now the waiting game starts again for the Department of Justice to take that information and go and investigate. Um, and in the meantime, if there are continuing violations taking place, you feel that that other people with disabilities are continuing to be discriminated against, and you've documented all of that, I suggest filing a second complaint and referencing the first one, even if it's not done, so that you're able to update the Department of Justice on all the info. Because that first
Mhm.
complaint is just going to be judged upon what you originally complained about and submitted. So if
Okay.
additional problems are taken, you have to notify them of those as well.
Okay. Very good. So much appreciate the time you've given to kind of educate us all on this. Now, if somebody wants to reach you, how can they do that?
Jeremy, Jeremy, at walkingspirit.org.
Okay.
So
Very cool.
that is my email address. You can also go to walkingspirit.org. There are some different ways to contact me through there as well. So, and
And you work with
again, I am
anybody in the United States?
buddy in the United States. If you want to specifically do ADA focused training, I am more than happy to travel internationally if the client is willing to pay for the trip.
Okay.
If you want me to come and just simply look at your accessibility and advise on what the right things are to do to ensure that you can get as many possible consumers and employees within your operation as possible.
Sounds cool. So, and also, they can also write to the Rotary Club too, at RotaryWDA at gmail.com, and I'll see that the information gets to Jeremy. So there's two ways of reaching you there. So
Thank
much
you.
appreciated. Fascinating conversation. It's something that's evolving even as we speak, and look forward. Maybe this is the second time we've had you back. You were the first person we've had back twice, so that's how good you are. So who knows? Maybe we'll have you back a third time for
Well,
something
thank you.
else. So okay,
I
very
hope
good.
so. I
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much.
I do want to clarify before go just fast. I am speaking from my experience and what I have learned. I am not an attorney. If you feel that
Mhm.
there's something that you need to consult an attorney about, I highly recommend that people do that.
Okay, very good. Thank you, and we hope everybody has a good rest of your day.